Marco thought about his village back in Switzerland and his family there. His father had asked him once why he wanted to join the Swiss Guard, what drove him to take on such responsibility. At the time, Marco had struggled to articulate it clearly. Now he understood. He served not because the church was perfect, but because it needed people who believed in its potential to be better, who would protect it not just from external threats but also help it face its own shadows. That was the real treasure he had found inside the Vatican. Not in a sealed chamber, but in the realization of what his service truly meant. And that discovery had left him, if not speechless, then profoundly changed in ways he would carry for the rest of his life. 3 weeks had passed since that harrowing night in the tunnels beneath the Vatican. Marco had spent the first week recovering from his injury, using the time to write detailed reports about everything he had witnessed. The investigation into the conspiracy had expanded dramatically, reaching far beyond the captured mercenaries. International intelligence agencies were now involved, tracing the money and communications that had funded the operation. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture of how deep the conspiracy had gone. The mastermind behind the attack was eventually identified as a wealthy collector of historical artifacts with connections to several extremist organizations. This man, whose name was being kept confidential for security reasons, had spent years researching Vatican secrets and had somehow obtained information about the sealed chamber. His plan had been to steal the documents, reveal them in the most damaging way possible, and use the ensuing chaos to acquire other priceless items from the Vatican's collections during the confusion. He had been arrested in his villa in Switzerland, surrounded by stolen antiquities from around the world. Marco had been called to testify before a special Vatican tribunal investigating the security breaches. He recounted everything he had experienced, from spotting Viktor Sokolov in St. Peter's Square to the final moments in the sealed chamber. His testimony helped establish a timeline of events and confirm details that the investigators needed. Throughout the process, Marco remained humble, always emphasizing the teamwork of the Swiss Guard and deflecting personal praise. During his recovery, Marco had received an unexpected visitor. The Pope himself had come to see him in the medical facility where he was recuperating. Marco had tried to stand when the Holy Father entered, but the Pope had gently insisted he remain seated due to his injury. They had spoken for nearly an hour, discussing not just the recent events, but also Marco's life, his family back in Switzerland, and his faith. The Pope had thanked him personally for his bravery and dedication, but more than that, he had listened with genuine interest to Marco's thoughts and feelings. What struck Marco most was when the Pope spoke about the documents from the sealed chamber. The Holy Father acknowledged the pain that would come from revealing such difficult history, but he expressed his belief that the Church could only move forward by confronting its past honestly. He spoke of the Swiss guards who had died in 1527, and how their sacrifice had been made even more tragic by the betrayals that contributed to the disaster. The Pope said that honoring their memory meant telling the full truth, not hiding behind comfortable myths. The public announcement about the discovered documents came on a Sunday morning during the Pope's weekly address in St. Peter's Square. Marco stood in his position near the papal platform, his arms still in a sling but his posture straight and proud. The Pope spoke with quiet gravity about the discovery, explaining in broad terms what the documents contained and what they revealed about a dark chapter in Vatican history. He acknowledged the corruption and betrayal that had occurred, and he offered a formal apology on behalf of the Church to the descendants of those who had died because of that treachery. The response was mixed. As Cardinal Rossini had predicted, some praised the transparency and courage it took to admit such failures. Others criticized the Pope for airing the Church's problems publicly. News organizations around the world covered the story extensively, with historians and religious scholars debating the implications. But what surprised many was that the majority of faithful Catholics appreciated the honesty. They had grown weary of scandals being covered up or minimized. This openness, though painful, felt like a new beginning. For Marco, life gradually returned to a routine, though it would never be quite the same. He had become something of a hero among his fellow guards, though he remained uncomfortable with the attention. Commander Muller had recommended him for commendation, and there was talk of accelerated promotion. But what mattered most to Marco was not recognition or advancement. It was the knowledge that he had fulfilled his oath in the most complete way possible. One evening, as the sun set over St. Peter's Basilica, painting the dome in shades of gold and orange, Marco stood alone in one of the quieter courtyards of the Vatican. Andreas found him there, and the two men stood together in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, Andreas spoke, reflecting on how close they had come to disaster that night in the tunnels. A few seconds slower, a slightly different decision, and the outcome could have been catastrophic, Marco agreed. But he also expressed something that had been growing in his mind over the weeks of reflection. He believed that they had been guided that night, that something greater than themselves had helped them find the right passages, make the right choices, and survive the dangers they faced. Andreas smiled and said that perhaps the spirits of the fallen Swiss guards from 1527 had been watching over their modern brothers, helping them succeed where the ancient guards had faced betrayal and death. The Swiss Guard as an institution had also been changed by these events. Security protocols were completely overhauled. The secret passages were all mapped with modern technology and fitted with new security measures. Training was intensified, and new emphasis was placed on intelligence gathering and threat assessment. The guards were given better equipment and more authority to act independently in crisis situations. Commander Muller led these reforms with the full support of Vatican leadership. Father Giuseppe invited Marco to visit the archives during the careful work of preserving and translating the ancient documents. The priest showed him pages that detailed the last moments of the Swiss guards who had fought at the Vatican during the sack of Rome. Their captain had written with great emotion about their bravery and loyalty, even as he recorded the bitter truth about the betrayals that had doomed them. Reading those words, written by a man who had faced impossible choices centuries ago, Marco felt a deep connection across time. The captain had written something near the end of his account that particularly moved Marco. He had expressed his hope that future generations of Swiss guards would serve a church that had learned from its mistakes, that valued truth as much as it valued tradition. He had hoped that his men's sacrifice would ultimately mean something beyond just protecting one pope during one crisis, that it would inspire a commitment to integrity that would outlast the stone walls of the Vatican itself. Marco realized that this was exactly what had happened. The captain's words, sealed away for 4 centuries, had finally emerged at a moment when they could help the church change course. The sacrifice of those ancient guards had been given new meaning. Their memory honored not through silence, but through the courage to face uncomfortable truths. And in a small way, Marco and his fellow guards had played a role in bringing that transformation about. As months passed, Marco's shoulder healed completely, and he returned to full active duty. He continued to serve with dedication and professionalism, but now with a deeper understanding of what that service truly meant. It was not just about physical protection or following protocols. It was about defending truth, maintaining integrity, and being willing to face danger, whether it came from armed attackers or from the harder challenge of confronting difficult realities. The wooden box with the ancient documents eventually went on limited display in a special exhibition about the history of the Swiss Guard. Marco attended the opening, standing quietly among the crowds as people viewed the artifacts that he had helped discover. He overheard visitors talking about the courage it took to reveal such information, and he felt proud, not of himself personally, but of the institution he served and the direction it was choosing to take. One visitor, an elderly woman with tears in her eyes, approached Marco after recognizing his face from news coverage. She thanked him for his service and told him that her faith had been strengthened by seeing the church admit its failures and commit to doing better. Her family's faith had been damaged by previous scandals, but this honesty had begun a healing process. Marco was deeply moved by her words, realizing that the impact of that night went far beyond just preventing a physical attack. As Marco left the exhibition and walked back through St. Peter's Square, he looked up at the massive basilica rising above him. Its beauty and majesty remained unchanged, but his understanding of what it represented had deepened. The church was not perfect, had never been perfect, and would never achieve perfection in this world. but it could strive toward truth and justice, and that striving itself was a form of faithfulness. The Swiss guards who had died centuries ago and the guards who serve today were all part of that same ongoing commitment. The wooden box was taken to the most secure room in the Vatican's secret archives under armed guard. Marco, despite his injury and exhaustion, was asked to remain present as one of the key witnesses to its discovery. His shoulder had been properly treated now, stitched and bandaged by Vatican medical staff, and his arm rested in a sling. The pain was manageable with medication, but it was the anticipation that made his heart race as he stood alongside Commander Muller. Father Giuseppe and several high-ranking church officials, Cardinal Rossini, the Vatican Secretary of State, had been summoned in the middle of the night. He was a tall, dignified man in his 70s with silver hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. He studied the box with a mixture of reverence and concern. The decision to open it had not been made lightly. Several officials had argued that something sealed for 400 years should perhaps remain that way, but the cardinal had overruled them. The attackers had known about this chamber and its contents, which meant the secret was already compromised. Better to know the truth than to remain ignorant while enemies possessed. Dangerous knowledge? Father Giuseppe carefully examined the bronze clasps that held the box shut. They were locked, but the mechanisms were ancient and could potentially be forced. However, the priest noticed something else. Hidden among the decorative carvings was a small keyhole, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The question was whether the key still existed after so many centuries. The priest consulted several old manuscripts, searching for any reference to where such a key might have been kept. While they waited, interrogations of the captured attackers continued in another part of the Vatican. Marco learned through Commander Muller that the men were mercenaries, hired by an unknown benefactor who had provided them with the intelligence about the secret passages in the sealed chamber. The leader, whose name was revealed to be Dmitry Volkov, had refused to identify his employer even under intense questioning. He had only smiled and said that there were forces at work that the Vatican could not comprehend or stop. After hours of searching through records, Father Giuseppe finally found a reference in a journal kept by a 16th-century archivist. The key to the box had been hidden within the archives themselves, placed inside a hollow statue of St. Peter that stood in one of the reading rooms. The statue was retrieved, and after careful examination, a small compartment was discovered in its base. Inside was a key, wrapped in oilcloth that had somehow preserved it through the centuries. The moment of truth had arrived. The room fell silent as Father Giuseppe inserted the key into the lock. It turned with surprising ease, as if the mechanism had been designed to last forever. The clasps released with soft clicks, and the priest slowly lifted the lid. Inside, protected by layers of silk that had mostly disintegrated into dust, were several documents written on vellum, the kind of treated animal skin that scribes had used before the widespread adoption of paper. Cardinal Rossini carefully removed the documents and began to read. His expression changed from curiosity to shock to profound sadness as he worked through the pages. The others in the room waited in tense silence. Finally, the cardinal looked up, his eyes reflecting deep emotion. He explained that these documents were indeed the true account of the sack of Rome in 1527. Written by the captain of the Swiss Guard who had led the defense of Pope Clement VII, the official history recorded that the Swiss Guard had fought bravely and that most had died, protecting the Pope as he fled through secret passages to Castel Sant'Angelo. But this account revealed something that had been deliberately hidden. The attack on Rome had not been a simple military assault by the mutinous troops of Emperor Charles V. There had been traitors within the Vatican itself, members of the papal court who had provided intelligence to the attackers in exchange for promises of power and wealth in the new order they hoped would emerge. The captain's account named these traitors prominent churchmen whose families still held positions of influence centuries later. It detailed how they had opened certain gates and disabled defenses at critical moments, leading to the deaths of not just Swiss guards but thousands of innocent people in Rome. The captain had reported these betrayals to Pope Clement VII, but the Pope had made the decision to seal away the truth. He had feared that revealing such corruption within the Church at that moment of crisis would destroy the faith of millions and potentially end the papacy itself. But there was more. Among the documents was a separate account, written in the Pope's own hand. It described his profound guilt over the decision to protect the traitors for the sake of the institution. He had spent the rest of his life carrying that burden, knowing that justice had been sacrificed for political necessity. The Pope had ordered the evidence sealed and had made his most trusted guards swear an oath to protect the secret until a time when revealing it would no longer threaten the churches. Survival Marco listened to all of this with growing understanding. This was why the attackers had been willing to risk everything to obtain these documents. In the wrong hands, this information could be weaponized against the Catholic Church. It could be used to undermine faith, to claim that the institution was built on lies and protected corruption. In an age of instant communication and social media, such revelations could cause immense damage. But keeping them hidden also meant perpetuating a historical injustice and denying truth. Cardinal Orsini faced a dilemma that echoed the one Pope Clement VII had confronted centuries before. He could seal away these documents again, maintaining the secret and protecting the Church from scandal. Or he could reveal the truth, accepting whatever consequences came from admitting that the institution had chosen political survival over moral clarity. The cardinal looked around the room at the faces watching him, waiting for his decision. After a long moment of reflection, the cardinal spoke. He said that the Church had spent too long prioritizing its own preservation over truth and transparency. The revelations of recent decades, the scandals that had rocked the faithful, all stemmed from a culture of secrecy and protecting the institution above all else. It was time for that to change. The documents would be authenticated, studied by historians, and eventually made public in an appropriate manner that provided proper context. There would be controversy, the cardinal acknowledged. There would be those who used this information to attack the Church. But there would also be an opportunity for the Church to demonstrate that it could face its past honestly and learn from it. The Swiss Guard had died protecting the Pope 400 years ago, even knowing that some within the Vatican had betrayed them. Their sacrifice deserved to be honored with truth, not protected by continued deception. Marco felt a profound respect for the cardinal's courage. This was leadership that put principle before convenience. Father Giuseppe carefully returned the documents to the box, and arrangements were made for specialists to begin the work of preservation and translation. The immediate crisis had passed, but Marco knew that the real work was just beginning. The conspiracy to steal these documents meant there were people who feared the truth coming out, and they would not simply abandon their plans as dawn broke over Vatican City. Marco finally left the archives and stepped out into the fresh morning air. His body was exhausted, and his shoulder throbbed despite the medication, but his spirit felt lighter than it had in years. He had joined the Swiss Guard to protect the Pope and serve something greater than himself. Tonight, he had done exactly that. Not just by stopping attackers with weapons, but by helping to protect truth itself. The real treasure in that sealed chamber had not been gold or relics, but the courage to face difficult history honestly. A medic quickly bandaged Marco's shoulder, while Commander Muller assembled a tactical team. 20 of the most experienced Swiss Guards were selected, along with support from Italian special forces who had been called in to assist. The commander spread out maps of the tunnel system on a table, and Marco used his memory to mark the locations where they had encountered the attackers. His hands were steady now, the initial shock replaced by focused determination. The plan was straightforward but dangerous. 3 teams would enter the tunnels from different access points, surrounding the chamber where the attackers had been positioned. The element of surprise was lost, but they had superior numbers and better equipment. Commander Muller emphasized that capturing the intruders alive was the priority. They needed to know if there were others involved and how deep this conspiracy went. The fate of the Pope and the security of the Vatican depended on extracting that information. Marco led the first team back through the passage he and Andreas had used. His shoulder ached, but the pain sharpened his focus. Behind him came 6 guards, all armed with modern weapons and wearing tactical gear. The ceremonial halberds had been left behind. This was not a time for tradition, but for survival. They moved swiftly through the tunnels, their night vision equipment turning the darkness into shades of green dot. As they approached the junction near the chamber, Marco signaled for the team to slow down. He could hear sounds ahead, but they were different now. Instead of confident voices, there was urgent movement and the sound of equipment being hastily packed. The attackers knew they had been discovered and were trying to escape. Marco's radio crackled softly with reports from the other teams. Team 2 had entered from the north and was closing in. Team 3 had encountered a sealed passage and was taking longer than expected. Marco made the decision to press forward. If the attackers escaped into the maze of tunnels, they might not be found again before they could execute whatever backup plan they had prepared. He led his team around the corner, weapons ready. The chamber came into view, and what Marco saw shocked him. The attackers were not fleeing through the tunnels. Instead, they were placing explosives against the wall of the chamber, seemingly preparing to blast through to another section. Before Marco could shout a warning, the leader of the attackers saw them. The man's face twisted into a snarl, and he shouted something in Russian. His companions immediately opened fire. Marco's team dove for cover behind the ancient stone pillars that supported the chamber's ceiling. The gunfight was intense and chaotic. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning, and the sound of automatic weapons echoed through the tunnels like thunder. Marco returned fire, his training taking over as he moved from cover to cover, advancing on the attacker's position. One of the intruders went down, hit in the leg by Andreas, who had appeared from a side passage with his portion of the team. But the leader continued to work on the explosives, his hands moving with practiced speed, even as bullets flew around him. Marco realized with growing horror that this man was not trying to escape. He was trying to complete the mission, even if it meant dying in the attempt. The explosive device beeped, indicating it had been armed. The leader smiled grimly and raised a detonator. Marco did not hesitate. He broke from cover and ran directly at the man, ignoring the danger from both gunfire and the imminent explosion. Time seemed to slow as he crossed the distance. He could see the leader's finger beginning to press the detonator button. With his last burst of energy, Marco launched himself through the air and tackled the man to the ground. They struggled for control of the detonator. Marco could feel his injured shoulder tearing further, warm blood soaking through the bandage. But he held on with desperate strength. The other attackers had been subdued or were in retreat, but this man remained focused solely on completing his task. He headbutted Marco, causing stars to explode in his vision, tried to wrench the detonator free. Andreas appeared above them and struck the attacker's arm with the butt of his rifle. The detonator flew from the man's hand and skittered across the floor. Marco scrambled after it, while Andreas and 2 other guards pinned the leader down. Marco grabbed the detonator and saw that it was a dead man's switch, the kind that would trigger if released. The leader had not pressed it yet, but if he had gotten free and let go, the explosion would have happened anyway, with shaking hands. Marco carefully disabled the detonator using techniques he had learned in training. The beeping from the explosive device stopped, and the chamber fell silent except for heavy breathing and the groans of wounded men. The immediate danger had passed, but Marco's mind was racing. Why had they been trying to blast through that particular wall? What was on the other side that was so important? Commander Muller arrived with reinforcements, and the attackers were secured and removed from the tunnels. Medical teams came for the wounded on both sides. As the chamber was cleared, Marco approached the wall where the explosives had been placed. He ran his hands over the ancient stones, feeling for anything unusual. There were markings here, very old, almost worn away by time. Latin words that he could barely make out in the dim light. Father Giuseppe was brought down to examine the wall. The elderly priest's eyes widened as he studied the markings. He explained that this wall had been sealed during the Renaissance over 400 years ago. According to fragmentary records, there had been a private chamber beyond it that belonged to a pope, whose name had been deliberately erased from many historical documents. The chamber had been sealed by decree, and all references to it had been removed from official archives. Whatever was inside had been deemed too dangerous or too valuable to remain accessible. The attackers had not been trying to reach the Pope at all, Marco realized. That had been misdirection, a way to draw security forces away from their true objective. They wanted what was in this sealed chamber. But what could be so valuable that people would risk an assault on Vatican City itself? Commander Muller made the decision to open the wall properly using controlled methods. Explosive experts carefully removed the devices the attackers had placed and set up their own precise charges. When the wall came down, sending dust and debris billowing through the chamber, Marco was among the first to enter. His flashlight beam revealed a small room, perhaps 5 meters square. The air that rushed out was ancient and dry, preserved by the sealed environment. In the center of the room stood a stone pedestal, and on that pedestal rested a single object. It was a wooden box, ornately carved and bound with bronze that had turned green with age. Father Giuseppe gasped when he saw it. With trembling hands he approached the box and examined the symbols carved into its surface. They were papal seals from the early 16th century, from the time of the sack of Rome, when the Swiss Guard had made their legendary sacrifice. The priest explained that this box had been mentioned in legends and rumors, but was thought to be myth. It supposedly contained the true account of what had happened during those terrible days, including secrets that had been kept hidden to protect the church. Marco watched as the box was carefully lifted and carried out of the chamber. Whatever secrets it held, whatever truths had been hidden for centuries, they had nearly fallen into the hands of people who would have used them for destructive purposes. The conspiracy went deeper than anyone had imagined, and the questions were only beginning. Who had sent the attackers? How had they learned about the sealed chamber? And most importantly, what was inside that ancient box that was worth so much risk and violence? Marco stared into the darkness of the secret passage, his hand instinctively moving to the weapon at his side. Andreas immediately radioed their discovery to Commander Muller, while Marco pulled out his flashlight. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing stone steps leading downward into the depths beneath the apostolic palace. The walls were ancient, constructed from blocks that had probably been laid centuries ago, and the air that flowed from the opening was cold and stale. Commander Muller's voice crackled through the radio, ordering them to wait for backup before entering. But even as Andreas acknowledged the command, both guards saw something that changed everything. Fresh footprints in the dust on the stone steps, leading down into the passage. Someone had walked this path very recently, perhaps within the last few hours. More alarmingly, the footprints led only one direction, down into the darkness. Whoever had entered had not yet come back out. Marco and Andreas exchanged a glance. They both knew that waiting could mean losing the intruder in the maze of passages below. If this person reached the Pope before they could be stopped, all their precautions would mean nothing. Marco made a decision that went against his orders, but followed his instincts. He stepped into the passage, Andreas close behind him. They moved quickly but quietly, their training guiding every step. The radio signal began to break up as they descended deeper into the ancient tunnels. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes opening into small chambers and other times narrowing so much that they had to move sideways. Marco's flashlight revealed details that spoke of incredible age. There were markings on the walls in Latin, probably left by the original builders. In one chamber, they found remnants of old torches still mounted in iron brackets. This was not just a simple escape route, but part of a complex system that had once served vital purposes for the Vatican's survival during dangerous times after what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 15 minutes. They heard a sound ahead. Voices, low and urgent, speaking in a language Marco did not immediately recognize. He signaled for Andreas to turn off his flashlight, and they continued in darkness, guided only by a faint glow that seemed to come from somewhere ahead. Marco's heart pounded so loudly he was certain it would give away their position. But he forced himself to breathe slowly and stay calm. They reached a junction where their passage intersected with another, larger tunnel. The voices were clearer now, and Marco counted at least 3 different speakers. Carefully, he peered around the corner. What he saw made his blood run cold. A group of 4 men stood in a circular chamber lit by battery-powered lanterns. They were studying a map spread out on a makeshift table, constructed from an old door propped on stone blocks. The map showed the layout of the Vatican, its various passages marked in red ink. But what truly terrified Marco was what else he saw in that chamber. Along one wall were several bags that clearly contained weapons and equipment. He could make out the shapes of automatic rifles, what looked like explosive devices, and communication gear. This was not a simple theft or act of vandalism. These men were preparing for an assault. They had positioned themselves in a place where Vatican security could not easily reach them. One of the men, clearly the leader based on how the others deferred to him, was speaking rapidly in Russian. Marco understood enough of the language to catch key words: Pope, tonight, access point. The leader traced a route on the map with his finger, indicating a path that would take them directly beneath the private chapel where the Pope often prayed in the evening. Marco realized with horror that these men planned to strike within hours, possibly even sooner. Andreas touched Marco's arm and pointed back the way they had come. They needed to get out, report what they had found, and bring reinforcements. But as they began to carefully retreat, Marco's foot caught on a loose stone. The sound echoed through the passage like a gunshot. The voices in the chamber immediately stopped. Marco heard the distinct click of weapons being readied. They had been discovered. There was no choice now but to run. Marco and Andreas sprinted back through the dark passage, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of heavy boots on stone. Gunfire erupted, the reports deafening in the confined space. Bullets ricocheted off the ancient walls, sending chips of stone flying. Marco felt a sharp pain in his shoulder, but did not stop. They had to reach the surface and warn everyone before these attackers could execute their plan. The passage seemed impossibly longer going back than it had coming down. Marco's lungs burned, and his injured shoulder throbbed with each movement. Andreas was right beside him, providing covering fire whenever their pursuers got too close. They burst through another intersection, and Andreas made a split-second decision to go right instead of continuing straight. Marco followed without question, trusting his fellow guards' instincts. This new passage angled upward more steeply, and Marco prayed it would lead them to safety. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer. The attackers knew these tunnels as well as Marco and Andreas did, possibly even better given how long they had been hiding down here. They emerged into a larger chamber, and Marco recognized it from the stolen documents Father Giuseppe had shown them. This was one of the oldest parts of the tunnel system built during the medieval period. On the far side of the chamber, Marco saw what looked like a newer door, possibly added in the last century. He ran toward it, Andreas covering their retreat. Just as they reached the door, one of the attackers appeared at the passage entrance behind them. Andreas fired twice, driving the man back into cover. Marco threw his weight against the door, and it gave way, sending them tumbling into a corridor he recognized. They were back in the palace, in a section near the Vatican museums. Immediately, Andreas got on the radio, his voice urgent as he reported their location and what they had discovered. Within minutes, the area was swarming with Swiss guards and Vatican security personnel. Commander Muller arrived, his face grave as he listened to Marco's rapid account of what they had seen. The commander made immediate decisions, ordering teams into the tunnels and evacuating the Pope to an even more secure location outside. Vatican City. Marco's shoulder was bleeding, and medical personnel tried to examine him, but he brushed them off. There was no time for that now. He knew those tunnels better than anyone else present because he had just navigated them. He could lead teams back to where the attackers were positioned. Commander Muller looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Despite his injury, Marco was going back down into the darkness. But this time, he would not be alone, and the hunters would become the hunted. After the incident in St. Peter's Square, Marco was taken to the security office for debriefing. His hands still trembled slightly from the adrenaline, though he tried to hide it. Commander Heinrich Muller, a stern man in his 50s with gray hair and sharp blue eyes, sat across from him in the small, windowless room. The commander had served in the Swiss Guard for 30 years and had seen more than most men could imagine. Commander Muller studied Marco carefully before speaking. The attacker had been identified as Viktor Sokolov, former Russian intelligence operative with connections to several extremist groups. During the interrogation, Viktor had said something that deeply troubled Vatican security. He had smiled and told them that stopping him meant nothing, because the real plan was already in motion. The words had sent shockwaves through the command structure, and now every available guard was being mobilized. Marco listened as the commander explained the situation. Intelligence suggested that there was a conspiracy involving someone inside the Vatican itself. For weeks, there had been unusual activities reported by various staff members. Documents had gone missing from secure archives. Private conversations had been overheard in places where no one should have been listening. Strange individuals had been seen in restricted areas late at night. All of these incidents had seemed unrelated until now. But Victor's confession had connected the dots in a terrifying way. The commander told Marco that he was being assigned to a special detail. Because of his quick thinking and bravery in stopping Victor, he had proven himself capable of handling high-pressure situations. Marco would be part of a small team tasked with sweeping the Apostolic Palace and identifying any security breaches. The Pope was being moved to a secure location until the threat could be fully assessed and eliminated. Marco felt honored by the assignment, but also deeply concerned. If someone inside the Vatican was involved, who could they trust? Within the hour, Marco found himself walking through corridors he had never entered before. The Apostolic Palace was a labyrinth of rooms, chapels, libraries, and offices that spanned centuries of construction. His team consisted of 4 guards, including Andreas and 2 others he knew only by reputation. They moved systematically through each area, checking for anything unusual. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on marble floors as they entered the Vatican's secret archives. Marco felt the weight of history surrounding him. These rooms contained documents dating back over 1,000 years, including papal bulls, state papers, and correspondence with kings and emperors. The air smelled of old parchment and leather bindings. Rows upon rows of shelves stretched into the shadows, lit only by dim overhead lights. A senior archivist, Father Giuseppe, accompanied them. His elderly face creased with worry. Father Giuseppe explained that several documents from a restricted section had been accessed without proper authorization 2 nights ago. The security logs showed that someone had used a stolen keycard to enter after midnight. The missing documents related to a historical event from 1527, when the Swiss Guard had made their legendary last stand during the sack of Rome. Over 100 guards had died protecting Pope Clement VII, and only 42 had survived. Marco knew this story well, as it was central to the identity and pride of every Swiss Guard. But why would someone steal documents about an event that happened nearly 500 years ago? Andreas voiced the question that Marco was thinking. Father Giuseppe led them to the restricted section and pointed to an empty space on one of the shelves. The missing files, he explained, contained not just historical accounts but also detailed maps of secret passages that had been built throughout the Vatican over the centuries. These passages had been used by popes to escape during times of danger, and their locations were one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Holy See. Marco felt a chill run down his spine. If someone had those maps, they could move through the Vatican unseen, bypassing all normal security measures. They could reach the Pope even in areas that were supposed to be completely secure. The realization hit all of them at once. This was not just about stealing information or creating chaos. Someone was planning to use those secret passages to get to the Holy Father. Commander Muller was immediately informed, and the entire security protocol was escalated to the highest level. Teams were dispatched to guard every known entrance to the secret passages. But there was a problem. The maps that had been stolen were from a collection that even current Vatican security did not have complete access to. Some of the passages shown on those ancient documents might not be in any modern database. There could be routes that everyone had forgotten about, hidden behind walls and under floors, waiting to be rediscovered by someone with the right information. Marco and his team were ordered to begin a physical search of the palace, looking for any signs of recent disturbance that might indicate someone had found and opened one of these forgotten passages. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, examining walls, checking behind tapestries, and looking for any inconsistencies in the architecture. The palace was enormous, and the task felt overwhelming, but they could not afford to miss anything. As night fell over Vatican City, Marco found himself in a section of the palace that was rarely used. Old storage rooms filled with furniture and artwork from past centuries lined a narrow corridor. The lighting was poor, and shadows seemed to move in the corners of his vision. He was about to mark the area as clear when he noticed something odd. One of the large wooden panels on the wall did not quite match the others. The wood grain was similar, but the panel itself seemed newer. As if it had been replaced at some point, Marco called Andreas over, and together they examined the panel more closely. When Marco pressed against it, he felt it give slightly, as if there was empty space behind it. Using a small tool from his equipment belt, he carefully pried at the edge. The panel swung open silently on hidden hinges, revealing a dark passage beyond. Cool air drifted out, carrying with it the smell of damp stone and something else. Something that made Marco's instincts scream danger. Someone had been here recently. The passage had been opened, and whoever had done it might still be inside the walls of the Vatican at that very moment. Before we begin this incredible story, please subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon so you never miss our best emotional stories. Your support means the world to us. The morning sun casts long shadows across the cobblestone streets of Vatican City as Marco Benedetti adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another ordinary day. At 28 years old, he had spent 5 years serving as a member of the elite Swiss Guard, the smallest army in the world dedicated to protecting the Pope. His blue, red, and yellow striped uniform had become like a second skin, and the weight of the halberd in his hand felt as natural as breathing. Marco came from a small village in the Swiss Alps, where his father had been a carpenter and his mother a schoolteacher. Growing up, he had always felt called to something greater than himself. When he learned about the Swiss Guard and their 500-year tradition of protecting the Pope, the training had been brutal, pushing him to his physical and mental limits, but he had persevered. Now, he stood as one of the select few entrusted with the safety of the Holy Father. That particular morning in late autumn felt different somehow. Marco could not explain it, but there was a tension in the air that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He had learned to trust these instincts during his training. His commander had once told him that a good guard does not just watch with his eyes but feels danger with his entire being. As he took his position near the Apostolic Palace, he scanned the crowds of tourists and pilgrims that had already begun to gather in St. Peter's Square. The Pope was scheduled to give a special address that afternoon, and security had been heightened due to recent threats that had been received by Vatican intelligence. Marco knew only fragments of information, as was standard protocol. The Swiss Guard operated on a need-to-know basis. But he understood that there were people in the world who wished harm upon the Holy Father. It was his sacred duty to ensure that no such harm would ever come to pass. As the morning progressed, Marco noticed a man in the crowd who seemed out of place. While most visitors were taking photographs and admiring the magnificent architecture, this man kept his head down and his hands in his pockets. He wore a dark jacket despite the mild weather, and he moved with purpose rather than the leisurely pace of a tourist. Marco's training kicked in immediately. He did not approach the man directly, but instead signaled to his fellow guard, Andreas, who stood 30 meters away. Andreas, a veteran of 12 years, acknowledged the signal with a slight nod. Together, they began to track the suspicious individual through the crowd. Maintaining their positions, but keeping their eyes locked on the target, the man moved closer to the barriers that separated the public from the restricted areas of the Vatican. Marco's heart began to pound, but his face remained calm and professional. He had been trained to never show fear or alarm, as it could create panic among the innocent people around him. The man suddenly stopped and looked directly at Marco. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Marco saw something that chilled him to his core. It was not anger or hatred, but rather a cold determination that suggested this person had made peace with whatever he was about to do. Before Marco could move, the man reached into his jacket. Time seemed to slow down. Marco's training had prepared him for this exact moment, and his body moved on pure instinct. He dropped his ceremonial halberd and sprinted toward the man, pushing through the crowd of startled tourists. Andreas was moving in from the other side, his hand already on his concealed sidearm. The Swiss Guard might dress in Renaissance-era uniforms, but they were equipped with modern weapons for situations exactly like this. Marco's mind raced through the protocols he had memorized. Neutralize the threat. Protect innocent lives. Secure the perimeter. Never let anyone harm the Holy Father. The man pulled something from his jacket, and Marco saw the glint of metal. Without hesitation, he launched himself at the suspect, tackling him to the ground just as Andreas arrived to assist. The object flew from the man's hand and clattered across the cobblestones. It was a knife, long and deadly, clearly intended for violence. Tourists screamed and scattered as other guards rushed to the scene. Within seconds, the man was restrained. Face down on the ancient stones of St. Peter's Square, Marco's chest heaved as adrenaline coursed through his body. His uniform was torn, and his knee was bleeding from where it had struck the ground, but he had succeeded. The threat had been stopped before any harm could be done. As senior officers arrived and took custody of the attacker, Marco stood and tried to catch his breath. He looked up at the towering facade of St. Peter's Basilica, its dome reaching toward the heavens, and felt the weight of what had just happened. What Marco did not know was that this incident was only the beginning. The man they had captured was not working alone. The real danger still lurked within the ancient walls of the Vatican itself. In the coming hours, Marco would discover secrets that had been hidden for centuries, and his life would never be the same again.